Welcome back, and thanks for being here for part 4 in my series about the Powell family murders. This video is going to be broken up into a couple of parts. I am going to first talk about what led up to the 2012 murder-suicide of Josh and his 2 boys, and then I'm going to talk a little bit more about the investigation that carried on into 2013, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the civil suit that just got wrapped up in July of 2020. So once we've covered all of that ground, and there's a lot, and I know we've covered a lot so far, but once we cover all that ground, we're gonna have a discussion about the forensic psychology behind this case, Josh's personality traits, narcissistic abuse, and what we can do to help people who are in abusive relationships right now. In part 3, we left off talking about the investigation into Susan's disappearance and how the walls were kind of closing in on Josh. Josh left Utah and went to go live in Washington with his family, but this didn't stop investigators from still pursuing him as the main suspect in Susan's disappearance. Josh and the rest of the Powells had obtained some of Susan's childhood journals and were trying to get them published in the media. They had even established a Susan Powell website to kind of help with their case and make Josh look like a better parent and person than he was. They were really trying to help him look sympathetic in the public eye, but no matter how hard the Powells tried, their true colors showed. And thanks to them blabbing to the media about Susan's journals and how important and insightful they were, police were able to get the search warrant for their house. And when they seized some of Josh and Steve's journals and computers, they found some really disturbing images, and it was enough to send Steve Powell to jail and enough to get Josh to lose custody of his boys. Washington State then took custody of the boys, and they started an investigation into Josh to see if he was a fit parent. They ordered Josh to be seen by a forensic psychologist, and during this doctor's evaluations of Josh, he interviewed him and they talked a lot, and Josh expressed some delusions that he had about the Mormon church, and he really revealed how paranoid he was and out of touch with reality. He would say stuff like how the Mormon church was on a slander campaign against him, trying to ruin the family name. And he talked about how Chuck Cox basically had a band of Mormons that were spying on him through, his website and keeping tabs on him. And he also brought up his allegations that Chuck had abused Susan in the past and that he was afraid that Chuck was going to abuse the boys. So obviously the forensic examiner is concerned when he hears about what Josh has to say about the Mormons and his wife's disappearance. And he notes that there's really not a lot of empathy, and he has a lot of traits of a narcissistic parent, which we've already kind of talked about. Even though this forensic psychologist didn't recommend reunification with Charlie and Braden, he did say that it would be okay for Josh to have supervised visits. And since the state of Washington technically has custody of the boys right now, these supervised visits were supposed to take place in a government facility. These supervised visits are meant to be held at a safe facility that's secure, an area where they can safely monitor these parents as they have the interactions with their families. Because a lot of the people that would be coming to this facility for supervised visits are probably in the middle of a custody battle or some type of investigation into their fitness as a parent. So it's supposed to be a safe way for the state to facilitate these interactions between parents who are sharing custody or might be, high risk to the children. So for a while, Josh did attend his supervised visits at one of these facilities, and there was a social worker from the state there supervising everything. But this didn't really last because a lot of the other parents who were having their visits around the same time that Josh was, they expressed concern and complained to the people higher up at the facility that they were uncomfortable with Josh being there. They didn't think that he was safe, that he was like a threat or a risk to their family and their safety. And I can understand feeling uneasy around Josh or around anybody who's in Josh's circumstance. There's a lot of suspicion, but I don't think that is enough to warrant the exception that they made for Josh here, because this was when they decided that they would allow Josh to have supervised visits outside of the facility and in his home. So the court and the forensic psychologist had both told Josh that he wasn't allowed to have his kids anywhere around Steve or in the house that Steve lived in. He needed to secure his own place of living and be independent if he was going to have his kids with him, because they knew that Steve was a really bad influence and that Josh had this lifelong history of like going back and falling on his family, and there's just too much dysfunction in that house for those boys to be safe there. So they told him, you know, you have to get a new place. So Josh went ahead and rented his own place in Washington, but it's widely believed that he never really lived there. He just sort of staged it to look like he had moved in, and secretly he was still living at Steve's house. The forensic psychologist did get a chance to do a walkthrough of this rental house, and he noted that there were some toys there for the boys and some stuff. It looked, I guess, convincing enough for the state to allow Josh to have his visitation here. So nearly 2.5 years after Susan's disappearance, Josh is supposed to have a scheduled visit with the boys on February 5th, 2012, and this was Super Bowl Sunday that year, and it was also the day that Josh decided to take his own life and murder his 2 boys. As the social worker was walking the boys up to the front door, they raced ahead of her, and Josh ushered them inside quickly before slamming the door in her face and locking her out. She knocked on the door multiple times trying to get let in, and when he wouldn't let her in, she walked back over to the driveway near her car and started to call 911. And this 911 phone call is so frustrating.
Reporting. Hey, I'm on a supervised visitation for a court-ordered visit, and something really weird has happened. The kids went into the house, and the parent, the biological parent, whose name is Josh Powell, will not let me in the door. What should I do? What's the address? It's 8119, and I think it's 89th. I don't know what the address is. Okay, that's pretty important for me to know. Sorry, I can't. Just a minute. Let me get in my car and see if I can find it. Nothing like this has ever happened before at these visitations, so I'm really shocked. And I could hear one of the kids crying, but he still wouldn't let me in. Okay, it is just a minute. I have it here. You can't find me by GPS? No. Okay, it is, I still can't find it. But I think I need help right away. He's on a very short lease with DSHS, and CPS has been involved. And this is the craziest thing. He looked right at me and closed the door. Are you there? Yes, ma'am. I'm just waiting to know where you are. Okay. It's 8119 189th Street, Court East, Puyallup, 98375.
She expresses the situation, and just the entire back and forth communication between this social worker and 911 call, it sends shivers down my spine and makes me have a visceral reaction, because you know what's happening inside as she's making that 911 call. And at one point in the call, she tells the operator, "I smell gasoline." And even still, I don't feel like the 911 operator shared her sense of urgency in the situation.
Out of the driveway because I smell gasoline, and he won't let me in. You want to pull out of the driveway because you smell gasoline, but he won't let you... He won't let me in. He won't let you out of the driveway? He won't let me in the house. Whose house is it? He's got the kids in the house, and he won't let me in. It's a supervised visit. I understand. Whose house is it? Josh Powell. Okay, so you don't live there, right? No, I don't. No, I'm contracted to the state to provide supervised visitation. I see. Okay. And who is there to exercise their visitation? I am. And the visit is with Josh Powell. And who supervises? And he is the husband that I supervise. So you supervise and you're doing the visit? Yeah, I supervise yourself? I supervise myself. I'm the supervisor here. Wait a minute. If it's a supervised visit, you can't supervise yourself. If you're the visitor... I do supervise myself. I'm the supervisor for the supervised visit. Okay, well, aren't you the one making the visit? Or is there another parent that you're supervising? No, I'm the one that supervises. I pick up the kids at their grandparents. Yes. And then who visits with the children? Josh Powell. Okay, so you're supposed to be there to supervise Josh Powell's visit with the children. Yes, that's correct. And how did... And he's the husband of missing Susan Powell. This is a high-profile case. How did he gain access to the children before you got there? I was one step in back of them. Okay, so they went into the house and then he locked you out. Yes, he shut the door right in my face. All right. And what agency are you with? Foster Care Resource Network. And the kids have been in there by now approximately 10 minutes. And he knows this is a supervised visit. 2. Braden is 5 and Charlie is 7. And the dad's last name? Powell, P-O-W-E-L, L. 2 L's? 2 L's at the end of Powell? Yes. His first name? His first name is Josh. Black, white, Asian, Hispanic, native? He's white. Date of birth? I don't know. He's about 39. How tall? 5'10", 150 pounds. Hair color? Brown. Did you notice what he was wearing? No, I didn't notice what he was wearing. Is he alone then, or is anybody else? I don't know. I couldn't get in the house. Are you in a vehicle now or on foot? I'm in a vehicle. I'm in a Prius, a 2010 Prius. What color is it? The door's locked. But he hasn't opened the door. I rang the doorbell and everything. What color I begged him to let me in. Elizabeth, please listen to my questions. What color is the Toyota Prius? Gray, dark gray. And the license number? I don't know. I can look. 750ZMH. Zebra Mary Henry? Yes. All right, we'll have somebody look for you there. Okay, how long will it be? I don't know, ma'am. They have to respond to emergency, life-threatening situations first. The first available deputy is responding. This could be life-threatening. He went to court on Wednesday, and he didn't get his kids back. And this is really, I'm afraid for their lives. Okay, has he threatened the lives of the children previously? I have no idea. All right. We'll have the first available deputy contact you. Thank you. Bye.
Block of
yes, he exploded the house.
Ma'am,
yes,
do you know okay, do you know the exact address of the house, or are you able?
It's 8119 189th Street, Court East,
okay.
2 hours.
Okay, stand line. Do you know if anyone's in the house?
Yes, there was a man and 2 children. I just dropped off the children, and he wouldn't let me in the door.
Okay, stand line for the fire department. Okay, I'm going to get them on the line.
There's 2 little boys in the house, and they're 5 and 7, and there's an adult man. He has supervised visitation, and he blew up the house and the kids. The kids and the husband and the father were in the house? Yes, he slammed the door in my face. So I kept knocking. I thought it was a mistake. I kept knocking, and then I called 911.
The house basically exploded and went up in flames. And The boys died and Josh is dead, thankfully. I mean, good riddance to him. I hope he's forever burning in hell. I hope that fire that he started has never gone out and it's still consuming his entire soul in hell. It just feels like so many people failed those boys. And it's not the social worker's fault. Because, like, what's she gonna do? Kick down the door? Even if the social worker had kicked down the door and played the hero in that moment, Josh could have killed her. He was wielding a hatchet in that house. There were a lot of people before the 911 operator and before the social worker that failed those boys. I don't blame the social worker or the 911 operator for the deaths of these boys. It's just so frustrating when we know what's about to happen. I think Josh is the only person that carries the ultimate blame. He's the one that chose to take these boys' lives. But I definitely think that Washington State also holds some liability because they allowed Josh to meet with those boys and have access to them off of the government property that was supposed to facilitate supervised court-mandated visits. Just this past year in 2020 in July, there was a hearing, a civil suit that Chuck and Judy had filed against the state of Washington. They wanted the state to admit and take responsibility for failing those boys and allowing those visitations to happen in the home with Josh when they had good reason to believe that he was abusing them and in immediate danger to them. The state tried to shove off the blame and say that there was no evidence that there was domestic abuse happening in that house or anything like that, but they had plenty of proof beyond the journals that they seized from Steve, where he is accounting experiences where he has thoughts about his own children. He's arrested for spying on children, taking videos of underage children. He takes his video to the frickin' playground and has confrontation with the adults there who are like, you need to leave and get out of here. Josh had them living with a pedophile. Josh himself had pornographic images that involved children and incest on his computer while he was raising these two young boys. And not to mention that Josh is the only suspect in the investigation into the mother's disappearance. The mother of these boys is missing. She's nowhere to be found. They're letting them stay with this father who is suspected of murdering her. And yeah, okay, sure, maybe they couldn't get him on that. They can't just take away your kids because you're a suspect in a missing persons case. I get it. Suspects still have rights and everything. But these children had rights too. These children's rights matter to me more than a suspect's rights, more than an adult's rights. I really don't care what anybody says about that. The children are the ones that need to be protecting. Yeah, we don't want to just send off innocent men and women to jail under suspicion or take their kids away from them out of suspicion, but at the very least, we need to protect those children. And even after knowing that Josh could have killed his wife and that there's an investigation going on that, the reason why the kids were taken from him in the first place should have been reason enough to never let Josh get anywhere near alone with those kids. And I understand that they sent a social worker out there to monitor it, but they just trusted this one little old lady to facilitate this meeting with these high-risk individuals with no protection, no other supervision. They were supposed to be having it in a facility where there would be security and cameras and no way for Josh to weasel his way in between the cracks and get the kids alone. Rather than do their jobs and handle a couple complaints from some angry parents, the state of Washington just let Charlie and Braden fall through the cracks. They want to talk about evidence of abuse, evidence of wrongdoing. CPS and child services across the board fail children because they don't recognize forms of abuse beyond direct, visible negligence and abuse. For them to have sufficient proof to actually break up a family and have the court intervene, they need documentable proof, evidence of abuse. And that means physical signs like bruises, black eyes, or the lack of food in the fridge. Something that is obvious, that they can say, this is happening, this is what it looks like. It's obvious, and it's something that we all recognize. So what I mean by this is, like, if somebody is abusing a person, hitting them with a belt, right? You would see those lacerations, you would see the marks, right? The victim's account of the abuse would line up pretty similar to that. They would be like, oh, yep, he hits me with a belt and I got this bruise and this laceration right here, and I get jumpy when they come around. That is a very obvious form of intimate partner violence or abuse, domestic abuse, okay? And same with no food in the fridge, you know? Those types of abuse are obvious in our society, and we can document them, and somehow it has turned into, like, those are the only forms that we will take as proof. And that's something that needs to change in our society if we're going to be able to protect people who are in a vulnerable group, because some of the worst abuse inflicted by narcissists, inflicted by sociopaths, is way sneakier than that. They're not leaving visible signs, they're not leaving visible evidence of their wrongdoings. They're being sneaky about it. A lot of the abuse is emotional, it could be sexual, and sexual abuse is usually happens when somebody is being manipulated and emotionally abused. And you can't always tell that about somebody just by looking at them. This case ended in unimaginable tragedy. They let those boys fall through the cracks. I don't really even blame the detectives in Utah that were handling this case, although I think they could have arrested Josh, and they didn't. And they couldn't have foreseen what Josh was going to do. I don't think anybody could have, but there were definitely signs that he was capable of going to extreme lengths to maintain control and possibly even getting rid of somebody who stood in his way. Maybe they couldn't have arrested him in the first couple of days into the investigation, but within a couple of months, I really feel like they could have. And they probably didn't, because most of the evidence was circumstantial. They didn't have a body. They didn't have a crime scene, really, even though the house was kind of a crime scene. And honestly, it wasn't really up to the detectives whether or not they were going to make this arrest. That's up to the DA to sign that warrant for somebody's arrest. And a lot of times when the DA sees that there's only circumstantial evidence in a case, they fear that it's not going to hold up in a court, and that could affect their conviction rate. So a lot of times they don't move forward with arresting people just based on circumstantial evidence, even though there's no other plausible reasoning for a person to have disappeared or for them to just not be around anymore. So I think that really after a couple of months, police had enough solid circumstantial evidence to hold up in a court of law, and I think, you know, pass the test beyond a reasonable doubt. And police, I think, were scrambling a little bit in the beginning. I mean, on the first day that they brought him in, they searched his car, and then they let him leave with it, you know? And when he brought it back the next day and they served it with a warrant to search it again, he had cleaned it all out. They got lucky when they found those couple of trash bags with the breakfast from Sunday, because they had been shoved under a seat and it seemed like he'd forgotten to throw them away. But the second time they searched his car on Tuesday, he left when they were searching it and got a taxi, went to the airport, rented a car, and went and did who knows what. And I wish that the police had been following him during this time. When they ended up giving his car back to him after the second search, they put a GPS tracker on it. And this GPS tracker was supposed to provide them with information in real time about Josh's whereabouts and what he was doing, where he was going. This tracker on Josh's minivan picked up a lot of important information, because in the first couple of weeks after Susan's disappearance, he was making a lot of random trips to dumpsters and making trips to Washington late at night where he had a lot of suspicious activity, like stopping abruptly on the highway for a minute or abruptly over a bridge. And it turned out that a lot of the places where he was going and stopping were dumpsters. So he was throwing stuff away. This also explains why he had those garbage bags in his car that contained the lunch from Sunday from their house. He had been disposing of the garbage and of evidence probably all around town at various, public dumpsters. And the police had this information. It was available to them in real time thanks to the tracker they put on his car. But for some reason, they weren't going out to these dumpsters and trying to recover or search through to see what Josh was dumping in them. They weren't following him. So I don't understand why they had enough sense to put the tracker on him, and they knew it was important to know where he was going and know his movements and whereabouts, but they didn't feel like it was urgent enough to actually go and track him. And it seems like they weren't, monitoring the information coming in from this GPS device, at least not frequently, because it's not listed in any of the police reports for the investigation that they went to go to these dumpsters and went to go check it out within a couple hours or even a couple of days after Josh visited them. So it's a shame that the detectives had this information in real time, back in 2009 when it would have been really useful, but yet nobody was going to those dumpsters and following up on this information. The police should have had somebody monitoring that GPS tracker 24/7, even if they're not tailing Josh and following him right behind him in a car. They should have been looking at what he was doing and realizing he's driving around town, stopping for a couple of minutes in different sections, driving a little bit further. It was suspicious activity just when you know the coordinates. And if you actually look up the coordinates like Dave Cawley did and you see that there's dumpsters that he's visiting, that's really suspicious, especially because he had that garbage in his car. And police found that garbage bag on the second day of the investigation. And on the third day of the investigation, they went to the house and they specifically checked the trash cans, and there was no trash in the house. The garbage cans in the kitchen and in the garage were empty. So if Josh really had some garbage that he needed to dispose of, he could have disposed of it right in his house if it wasn't suspicious. But clearly he was trying to put it in places where police would never find it, which is just obvious that either it was evidence or just important incriminating information that he didn't want police to get their hands on. I get that it's easy for me to sit here and be like, they should have done this and they should have done that. Hindsight lets us see these things more clearly than obviously people who are seeing them in real time. But they should have been covering all of their bases and monitoring that GPS tracker, because it would have provided them with so much information. And it took 9 years later for Dave Cawley of the Cold podcast to really uncover everything that was in these records. And who knows what they would have found if they went and followed up on what had been tossed in those dumpsters, because we still don't really know what Josh did to Susan and how he disposed of her. I have my theories, other people have their theories, but we're never going to know for sure because that stuff can't be recovered. That evidence is lost forever. We'll never know what he went out of his way to hide. At this point, we'll probably never know what happened to Susan. So much evidence is lost. So many answers are lost because so many of the key players in this story are dead. But I think we can all agree that Josh definitely killed Susan. He proved that he was capable of killing people that he's supposed to love when he murdered his 2 sons. So I think it's just obvious that when he started to lose control of Susan, he killed her and disposed of her in some way. I'm sure that it was really frustrating for police. They spent all of this time investigating and they never really got what exactly they were looking for. Police had even gotten a warrant to wiretap the Powell's phones, and they were conducting surveillance on them, listening to their conversations when Josh lived in Washington. And while they didn't get a confession or a recording of Josh, saying exactly where Susan is or what he did to her, I think they gathered a good amount of circumstantial evidence. They heard Josh saying stuff about how he was trying to manipulate the public's opinion, and his main concerns weren't where his wife was or if she was coming back. His main concerns were money and getting an interview with a big network television and making himself look good and maintaining control. Yeah, it's circumstantial, but it paints a really good picture of who he is, because when he knows he's on camera, like in front of the media, or even if he's the one holding the camera and recording stuff, he paints this picture of a very sympathetic husband, like he's a victim himself basically. And yet this is vastly different from what he's talking about on the phone with his family. He's talking about how sick he is of playing the nice guy role and how he needs to throw out more theories about what could happen to Susan. So that right there is evidence that he is trying to manipulate the narrative and interfere with their investigation because he's lying. I think that they overlooked a lot of circumstantial evidence that would have held up in court, but they really wanted a confession, a body, or some talk that was a little bit more obvious and blunt than what they already had gotten through the phone wires and stuff. Through this wiretap though, they did obtain a lot of information about the dynamics in the Powell family. They learned just how smart Josh and Michael were and how sneaky Steve was. I can't imagine what it must be like to be one of the social workers or detectives that was involved in this case, to live with that feeling of like, what if I did this, or could I have stopped it? And that must be really hard, and I can't imagine anything like that. And Detective Maxwell, the lead investigator on the case, even told Dave Cawley of the Cold podcast that, you know, this case taught him that if he ever had a gut feeling that he needed a search warrant, he wasn't held back by lack of physical evidence. If he only had circumstantial evidence, he was still gonna go forward with trying to gain access and get those warrants before a judge, because he knew the consequences of like just standing by and letting these things happen. And I hope that, you know, other police officers and law enforcement would start to do that too, because I know a lot of police officers, law enforcement agencies are held back from making arrests when they just have circumstantial evidence, because district attorneys don't want to mess up their conviction rate. They want a high conviction rate because it looks good for their career, looks good for their job. And I'm not saying that every district attorney or elected official or police officer is only worried about conviction rates and stuff like that, but I think that a good majority of them are.
So I'm editing right now, and I just want to add that some prosecutors and district attorneys might also avoid arresting a person just based on circumstantial evidence, because if they go to court and they're found to be not guilty, then they can't be tried for the same crime twice. That's double jeopardy. So some DAs might argue that it could actually hinder the pursuit of justice to try somebody for a crime too early with only circumstantial evidence and without any real physical evidence connecting them to the crime.
I get that they might be held back by trying to maintain a high conviction rate, but that gets in the way of justice more often than not, and I don't want to see that happen anymore. And I think a lot of people who have followed this case closely would agree with me that that's one of the main reasons that they didn't arrest Josh. They so badly wanted a body and wanted something like so hardcore and tangible physical evidence that would prove that he did something. But, you know, they're overlooking the fact that they had so much circumstantial evidence. What other reason would Susan have gone missing? The suspicion behind his midnight camping trip, the blood that they found. If they had followed up on these GPS trackers, they would have known that he was doing dumpster drops in the days after her disappearance. He had her cell phone. I think that all the evidence they had within a couple of months to a year into the investigation would have been enough to stand up against reasonable doubt in a court, you know? But I guess they didn't feel that way. Josh picked up and left 2 weeks into the investigation. He left Utah to go live with his family in Washington, so yes, that made things harder, but they did their best to keep investigating from afar. I think that the West Valley Police Department back in Utah, they did a lot more than some other police departments would have done in this investigation. Some departments might have just handed off over to Washington and thought, it's their problem now, but they kept investigating, so I want to give them credit for that. And I think they really did care, and they wanted to find Susan, and they had those boys' best interests in mind. They were just trying to go about it really by the books. I can only imagine that they tried their best and really tried to move forward after this case by learning from it and wanting to do better. The police academy and police handbook or whatever, I'm sure they teach rigorous protocol and they go through a certain amount of training, probably not as much as all of us would like to think, but there's not always a step-by-step plan of action for how to deal with situations like the Powell case, or how to deal with certain types of abuse that there's not a lot of research on or training around. Some cops have training on intimate partner violence and domestic abuse and what that looks like and how to proceed from there. And some states even have laws about prosecuting even if the witness or the victim doesn't feel like pressing charges, but not every state has training around what emotional abuse, sexual abuse, and other forms of abuse look like, and what the protocol is to address that, document it. So hopefully moving forward we can bring more awareness to these different types of harm that people are facing, and this awareness will hopefully spark more research around it, and we can implement it into the protocols and plan of action that we take to help enforce the law and save people who are part of vulnerable communities. Even after the murder-suicide in 2012, the investigation continued because the police weren't just going to let it go, as they shouldn't. They still wanted to find Susan, and there was also a question of, who is to blame for all of this? Could this have been avoided, especially since Child Services in the state of Washington had gotten involved in the case at the very end? There was no way that this case was just going to be left alone at this point, and Michael had been the one telling the entire family to stop talking. He had been the one holding out hope that all of this would just go away if Josh and Steve stopped talking. In the wiretap, Michael even said too, he was like, if we just don't talk and we don't give them anything, it'll all just go away. And people who are familiar with plenty of cases here in the true crime community know that that actually happens. I mean, a lot of time if police hit a wall, if they hit a dead end and they don't have any more leads or anything to go off of, the case goes cold and there's just zero activity on it. Nobody's really actively investigating or putting their time towards it. He knew that in some cases, when the police don't have enough evidence or anything, their hands are tied. And sometimes people get away with murder, and sometimes murders go unsolved for years and years and sometimes forever. But the West Valley police, they weren't gonna let that happen. And they kept investigating even after Susan and the boys were gone, Josh is dead, and Steve Powell's in jail. The people that hold some of the answers to the case are a lot more limited now, and so during the rest of the investigation, from 2012 to around 2013, the police really focused all of their efforts on putting pressure on Michael and Steve. And during this time, Steve is in jail, and Michael is in Minnesota pursuing his doctorate degree. So the police went to jail a couple of times to question Steve, and he never really gave them much insight into, Josh's mindset. And this is probably because Steve was so far out of touch with reality. So he wasn't really a big help to them, and neither was Alina. This left Michael, and the police knew from these wiretaps that Michael was very smart. He could still hold a lot of answers. If Josh told anybody about what he did to Susan, it was probably Michael. So the police made a couple of trips out to Minnesota where Michael was living to question him. They basically told him, your cooperation isn't just in the best interest of the public and Susan's family, it's in your best interest because an investigation like this could put your military career and your doctoral pursuit in jeopardy. So I think this definitely spooked Michael, and there was a deposition scheduled to uncover some more information that some of the Powell family might have about the case. The purpose of this deposition was to question Michael and see if he had anything to offer. They wanted to see if he had any insight or knowledge of what Josh did with Susan, but Michael pretty much refused to answer most of these questions. He pled the fifth, and after this deposition, Michael went to a parking garage to take his own life. He went up to the 7th floor, the top floor, and he jumped from the edge of the building. Just like Josh, under the pressure of this investigation, Michael chose to take his own life. Thank God he didn't take anybody else with him, but with Michael's death, that marks one more loss in this case. As I said, he was probably Josh's greatest asset and his confidant, and I think he felt the walls closing in too, even though he didn't say much at the deposition, and even though they didn't really have much on him to arrest him or anything, he could feel the walls closing in, and he knew that he wasn't going to escape this circumstance and this investigation unscathed. And just like Josh, he needs everything to be on his terms. I don't know if he felt guilty about the outcome of everything, if he felt guilty about what happened to the boys. It's uncovered through the wiretaps that there were plenty of conversations in the months and weeks leading up to Josh's murder-suicide where Michael was questioning the family and questioning Josh if there was something really wrong. You know, he kept pointing out that Josh is despondent. Michael was worried. He asked Josh multiple times if he was okay and what's wrong. So I don't know if he maybe had an inkling or the thought in the back of his head that something terrible was about to happen, or that Josh was contemplating doing something terrible and at his wit's end. Josh could have been planning to murder Susan, and maybe he let Michael in on this and maybe he didn't. Maybe that's why Michael's phone was turned off a couple of days leading up to Susan's disappearance. But in the end, Michael took his own life, and with it, this investigation really went cold. Steve wasn't giving a lot of information from prison, and Alina wasn't really much of a help either. So now we have Susan gone, the boys gone, and Josh and his brother Michael are all dead. And in 2017, Steve Powell was released from prison after serving 7 years for voyeurism charges. Luckily, he didn't last long outside of prison, and he died in 2018. The world is better off without him and without Josh, and probably Michael too. Jennifer Graves did come out with a book called A Light in Dark Places, and she speaks out against domestic violence, as well as the Cox family. They have made it their mission to protect children and women from abusive relationships and trying to raise public awareness about the effects, impact, and escalation of these more subtle types of abuse. Alina largely remains out of the public eye. She gave an interview to Oxygen Network a couple of years ago, but that's probably the last we're gonna see of her. After Josh's murder-suicide and the death of Michael and Steve, the case has pretty much run cold, and the only real new information we have is stuff that we found out from Dave Cawley of the Cold podcast. So after the deaths of Charlie and Braden, Chuck and Judy Cox were now not just seeking justice for what happened to Susan, but what happened to the boys. And they tried to get a bill passed in Washington state that's known as the Charlie and Braden bill, and this bill was meant to help protect victims' rights, specifically children of people who are under investigation for murder or a disappearance. One of the main reasons why Josh was able to maintain custody of the boys even during an investigation like this is because sometimes the law favors adults' rights more than children. So no one wanted to violate Josh's right as a person or as a suspect, but in doing that, they really failed the boys. I understand the controversy around this bill. I just don't agree with it. I don't I'm not calling for innocent people to be locked up without a fair trial, the due process. They should be proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt before they go to jail. But in order to preserve the safety of the children involved, I think that the state or officials need to get involved in order to maintain their safety. Of course, there has to be limitations and there has to be a due process, but when we value adults' rights over children's rights, who is the person who is going to step up and protect those kids? And this case just proves that, you know, outsiders don't really have a gauge for how far perpetrators are going to take it. I think given all of the circumstantial evidence they had around Josh's case, anybody could logically deduce that these kids could possibly be in danger or at risk at least for some serious mental and emotional trauma if they're staying in Josh's house. Most services like child welfare and CPS are all about reunification of families. They only will split up a parent from their child in the worst case scenarios. And I understand that a lot of studies and research shows that children thrive best when they're in a stable atmosphere with their natural parents or the person that they're most familiar with who's like raised them since a kid. It can be very disruptive to take children out of the environment that they've known pretty much since they were born. But sometimes the damage that taking away a kid can cause is nothing compared to the damage that might be caused if we just leave the child in the care of that adult who is in question for murder. Charlie and Braden's case is a perfect example of that. They had Chuck and Judy Cox, and even Jennifer's family, the Graves, were willing to take Charlie and Braden in. They had multiple familiar family members that were ready to take them in. So the state didn't have to like take away full custody and make it, you know, a set in stone thing that Josh could never see his kids again, but they should have at the very least removed those kids from his care earlier than they did. And that's exactly what Chuck and Judy believed too, and that's why they were fighting to get this law passed. And even though it wasn't passed in Washington, a similar law was passed in Utah. And the Cox family actually was still fighting up until 2020 to seek justice for Susan and the boys. So in March of 2020, they entered into a civil trial against the state of Washington because they claimed that the state was liable for what happened to the boys. And because of the COVID-19 pandemic, this trial got postponed for a while. But luckily in July of 2020, it started up again, and they found that the state of Washington was liable for what happened to these boys. And I think that the jury delivered a pretty fair verdict here, because the state of Washington, whoever was ahead of that Child Protective Service program that had legal custody of Charlie and Braden, failed them because they went against court-directed orders that Josh should not be alone with those children and should only have access to them in supervised visits at a, you know, government safe facility. And some of the social workers that were in charge of the case had like checked off boxes saying that there was no need for an investigation into domestic abuse in this case, which is just ridiculous given what they found on Josh's computers and the whole reason that he lost custody of the boys in the first place. So there's still activity going on with the settlement procedures from this civil trial, and Chuck and Judy Cox plan on spending the rest of their lives fighting for victims of domestic abuse and trying to protect children like Charlie and Braden. I think that's very admirable. The unimaginable trauma and heartbreak that they faced throughout like a 3 to 4 year period of their life is something that you and I can not imagine. No one can imagine that unless it happens to you. So for them to be able to carry on and still be strong enough to advocate for others, I think is completely amazing and just shows how well-rounded they are and their hearts are in the right place, unlike the Powell families. So, I mean, Jennifer Graves excluded from that, of course, but that's pretty much all of the information that we have on this case, and we may not have answers about where Susan is or where the boys are, but what happened here and the investigation that followed gives us so much to look at, learn from, and move forward with. So now we are at the part in this series where We've taken in all of this information about the case, about the investigation, about Josh's family history leading up to his marriage to Susan, the dynamic of the marriage, to the actual crimes and investigation. There has just been so much ground that we've covered in this. And personally, I have a lot of thoughts about this case. I had a lot of thoughts before I even started this series, but sitting down, talking about it, and writing notes and doing my own extra research to prepare for these videos has forced me to look at it a bit deeper than I ever have before. And this was one of the first cases I heard about when I became interested in true crime. And that was years and years ago. And since then, I have dedicated a lot of my time and energy to learning about forensic psychology and just psychology in general, because I think that's what fascinates me the most about true crime. The mindset behind these perpetrators and why they did what they did, because it's just so unimaginable. In order for me to feel like I have any closure or answers about the case, I feel like I need to understand what was going through everyone's mind leading up to it. And I always knew that Josh and Susan's case was unique in a sense that it presented evidence of a type of abuse that we are not largely familiar with in our society. And I think domestic abuse is already stigmatized, and it's the awareness that we have on it and the research is still fairly new. Through the research that we have around IPV, intimate partner violence, we know that like this type of abuse sparks a sense of urgency in the people around the victim and usually in the victim themselves. It's a very overt, obvious way of hurting somebody. If someone expresses their anger and takes it out physically on their partner, we all would pretty much agree that that's abuse. You can't just get upset and hit somebody. I mean, even if it wasn't a domestic issue, if you did that kind of thing out on the street or out at Walmart, you know, somebody would probably press charges against you and that would be considered assault. So obvious forms of physical abuse are kind of right now what society is pretty familiar with. And sociopaths and smarter criminals, smarter abusers know how to navigate abuse and do it in a way where it's not obvious to the people around them, and sometimes it's really not obvious to the victim themselves. There is one analogy that is called like the robber victim scenario. This example is really helpful. It's kind of like a scam versus like an armed robbery. So like if somebody has a gun pointed to their head and the robber is like, give me all your money, you know, and somebody gives them all of their money, that would leave the victim in a very traumatized state. They might be like, oh my gosh, I was so scared. They held a gun to my head, forced me to give them everything that I had, and they stole my money. But some people who are still looking to rob people of their money are a lot smarter than this robber who used an armed force to take what he wants. The robber who uses a gun or, you know, violence to take what they want, they're not as smart because they're less likely to get away with it. There are way smarter criminals out there who are still looking to take your money, but who will employ much more manipulative, subtle tactics in order to rob you. Lots of old people, vulnerable people get scammed online to give over money to people that really have no intention other than robbing them, right? But the scammer is successful in this method because they play nice, they give the victim lots of attention, maybe even a sob story about why they deserve the money, and the victim ends up handing over the money, giving it to the robber, and usually the person who's being scammed doesn't like look at it like they're being scammed. They don't have the perception that they're being robbed of their money. But they are. Outsiders can see like, okay, this is a scam, this person's just like manipulating you into doing it. In both case scenarios, whether it's an armed robber or a scammer, both case scenarios, they're stealing money from innocent people and they're doing something wrong, but one person is doing it in a very overt, obvious, physically violent way, and the other person is doing it very sneaky to the way that the person might not even realize that they're the victim of a crime. This is very similar to forms of emotional and narcissistic abuse. people who are being physically abused might know and understand that they're being physically abused and that it is a injustice to them and that it's wrong. But people who are being abused by narcissists, people who are being abused emotionally, verbally even, don't always realize that what's happening to them is abusive. They might think that somehow it's their fault or that they inherited this burden because they let that person into their lives in the first place. And I can't help but think that this is probably along the lines of where Susan found herself. I think that she didn't fully recognize that what was happening to her was terribly abusive and very scary. Narcissistic abuse is hard to recognize. It's not something that we learn about in our health class when we talk about romantic relationships, but it should be. I think that Josh was a narcissistic parent and a narcissistic father, and in this section of the video, I'm just going to kind of word vomit my reasoning behind that, because just after analyzing this case for so long, thinking about it so much, I have a lot to say about Josh Powell. And this is my time where I'm just going to kind of like go at it without holding back. So just keep in mind that this is my opinion and this is all of my takeaways that I've gotten from analyzing the case. And obviously I've never spoken to Josh or anybody involved in the case, but I've done my fair share of research, and this is how I feel about Josh and everything that he did to Susan, to the boys, and everyone around him. Obviously, I am not a mental health expert. I don't claim to be. I just really like psychology, and I've taken some classes in high school and in college. But I think I see Josh's actions for what they were, and I think I see Josh for who he was. So I'm just gonna go through a couple of key characteristics of narcissistic husbands and talk about why Josh like perfectly fits into that profile. Some of the information, the comparisons I'm gonna be making are pulled directly from Dr. Todd Grande's YouTube video called 10 Signs of a Narcissistic Husband. Dr. Todd Grande's video helps illustrate some key characteristics and personality traits of a husband who might be displaying narcissistic abuse or narcissistic attitudes towards their wife. And I'm not going to go through all 10 of those. If you want to see them, go watch the video. I'll link it in the description below. But I think that some of the points that he makes in that video accurately describe Josh. Josh exhibited many of the key characteristics of a narcissist. He was self-centered, entitled, and not a lot of people liked him. He wasn't a very agreeable person. I think at different points in his life, his narcissistic traits were more obvious than others. In some of the writings that we now have access to, we can see that he's a narcissist because he thinks that he can do anything or take on anyone. He has an inflated sense of self-worth. So he thinks that he can be a lawyer when he has no law training at all. So very narcissistic, and he feels like he can outsmart police and he's one step ahead of everybody. His self-worth is so inflated that he thinks that he is like the target on the radar of the Mormons of America. He thinks that everybody's out to get him. Many narcissists have this fantasy of the ideal love. And the ideal love is somebody that will dedicate themselves to the narcissist. Someone whose entire purpose in life is to serve the narcissist, to be their emotional support and to provide for them, whether it's financially, emotionally, or whatever. A lot of narcissists, when they come into contact with somebody who they believe fits all the criteria for their ideal love fantasy, they employ a tactic called love bombing. And this means showering the object of their affection with attention, gifts, admiration, and whatever is gonna win their heart and woo them. Josh definitely did this to Susan. He was at a point in his life where what he was craving the most was unconditional love, a partner who worshipped him and thought he was like the greatest thing ever. Josh's parents' divorce took a toll on him, and the rejection he faced when he was in high school, not being able to find a girlfriend, it compounded until the importance of finding that ideal love was really all that mattered in Josh's life. And when Susan stumbled into his life, She fit that role perfectly, and Josh totally love-bombed her. He showed her everything that she wanted to see. You know, he gave her all this attention, put on a show for her, you know, made himself appear like this independent man who can sustain himself and sustain his family. He put on the whole religious act and showed Susan exactly what she wanted to see. A lot of times when abusers and narcissists love-bomb somebody, it's a period of time that is looked at as almost like a honeymoon phase, you know, especially the victim is really content and emotionally satisfied. And Josh definitely did this with Susan. He gave her a taste of that like adventure and rebellion that she always kind of was drawn to. And yet he also provided a stable, spiritual ground for her to fall back on. And that is exactly what he presented to her in the early parts of their relationship and when they first got married. So Susan fell for it, as a lot of people who are love bombed do fall for it. It's the actions after this love bomb that really determine whether or not it's a manipulative relationship or narcissistic abuse, because plenty of relationships start off in a honeymoon phase where everything's great, and then, you know, as you get comfortable and you start to share different parts of your life, it becomes a little bit more messy and less ideal. That's very normal with relationships, whether you're just in a long-term relationship or you're married. But the difference here, the difference with an abusive relationship and the difference with Josh and Susan's relationship is that, like, even after the love bomb calmed and the dust kind of settled, Josh didn't really continue his affection or proper treatment of Susan after this. As soon as he got Susan hooked and her feelings increased, his excitement with the relationship kind of subsided. And, you know, once he was married to Susan and he had locked her down, he worked on checking out and everything declined from here. And this is where he started abusing her and where he let other people, including his own father, abuse Susan. So obviously he never really loved her. It was all kind of just a ploy to get her in. And Susan, right up until her disappearance, was kind of worried about this, especially as Josh slipped away from his religion and stopped playing the nice guy act. She wondered if this was all a ruse to sort of entrap her into this long-term committed relationship, and she didn't want to believe it, but I definitely believe it was true. I think that the entire thing was an act. The only time in Josh's life that he was actually like committed to Mormonism and to the church for an extended period of time was when he was courting Susan. So, you know, maybe he was drawn to religion as sort of like a sanctuary, as a safe place at first, but I think then he realized, you know, there's a lot of vulnerable people in this community, and Susan was one of them, and as soon as he got his hands on her, that was it for him. Narcissists tend to manipulate and use things for their own advantage, so I think that he used Mormonism and the religion and that whole nice guy act as a way to have access to Susan, or as a way to gain access to anybody who he could then, you know, manipulate and control. And as soon as he got his hands on Susan and locked her down, he had no use for the church anymore. He had no use for this nice guy act, so he slowly, you know, let it disintegrate and deteriorate before her eyes. Many narcissists see the people around them, especially members of their own family, as extensions of themselves. There's some kids playing outside right now, so if you overhear them, that's what's happening. Whatever, hope they have fun. They're riding bikes. Anyway, back to narcissists. Definitely what they're doing outside is much lighter than what I'm doing in here. I kind of envy that, but anyway, here we go. A lot of narcissistic husbands need their family members and the people around them to reflect their own values and to reflect the characteristics and personality traits that a narcissistic finds most valuable, you know? So if the narcissist wants to come off as smart and intelligent, they're going to demand that of their children and their spouse too. And Josh definitely did that with his kids. So Josh really only interacted with his kids when he was trying to get them to be interested in stuff that he was interested in. Even in the wiretaps and some of the home videos we have of Josh, he's pretty snappy at the kids and he's very manipulative of them. When he lived with Steve and during the investigation into Susan's disappearance, Josh tried very hard to instill in his kids the same values and beliefs that he had. So he would brainwash them to hate Mormons and to say bad things about Mormons. And Charlie and Brayden would go to church and go to summer camp and repeat these things that their father was instilling in them, saying that Mormons are bad and that you should swear around Mormons so that Mormons go away. And in one of the wiretaps, they quoted Josh saying that he was proud of Charlie because he turned to him and said, "You know what, Daddy, F the Mormons." So it was obviously very important to Josh to instill in his kids not just the same interests and hobbies, but he needed them to have the same beliefs and values. I think a good, responsible parent would introduce their children to, higher level thinking, and religion is definitely a part of that. But hopefully they would encourage their children to explore the different ideas for themselves and come up with their own conclusion so that they have their own beliefs as an individual person, rather than just being like, this is the way it is. Josh hated the Cox family and he tried really hard to turn the boys against the Cox family. When Susan was alive, she would walk in on conversations that Josh was having on speakerphone with his family back in Washington in front of the boys, where he'd openly be talking poorly about Mormons and about Susan. So he's manipulating these kids to share the exact same beliefs as him, and also he's manipulating the kids to go against Susan. And I think this was another, way for Josh to implement his control, and this is another classic characteristic of narcissists. They use children to further manipulate, control, or put down their spouse. Sometimes narcissistic parents envy the love that the children might have for the other parent, especially if it's the mother. Children, especially young children, tend to be very attached to their mother, and these boys were definitely attached to Susan because she was like their one warm place in this scary world, in this household that they lived in. And I think Josh envied that, and especially once Susan was gone, he really tried to turn those kids against her. And even though some of the videos he put out on the Susan Powell website, had him being like, "We love mommy so much. How much do you miss her?" The stuff that he was talking about in his private time that the police got through the wiretaps was complete opposite. He was talking pretty horribly about Susan. He was agreeing with Steve in some conversations that Susan was promiscuous and problematic, which is completely delusional and off base. So I think he was probably really jealous of Susan and resented the love that the boys had for her. So that's one of the reasons why he tried to turn them against her and instill in them values that were specifically opposite to, what she stood for. Josh looked at Susan as somebody who was just meant to fulfill his needs. She was just supposed to listen to him, to everything that he said. And he didn't look at their marriage as a partnership or as camaraderie, like they're in this together and that they both are responsible for making decisions and compromises. He demanded that everything happened on his terms, and he made Susan compromise, and he was never willing to do that himself. So Josh controlled what they did with the car, how they spent their money. He pretty much made all of the big decisions in their relationship, not because Susan was passive, but just because he exerted so much control over her, and he had such an unwillingness to bend or compromise in her direction in any way. A lot of narcissists are very controlling over the people around them just because they want them to put off an image that they deem acceptable, and they're often very jealous or self-conscious about the interactions that their spouse and loved ones have with other people. I think this is one of the reasons why Josh had Susan quit her cosmetology career. He was really jealous of the interactions and the praise that she had at that job, and it gave Susan a sense of independence and sustainability that was beyond Josh, and that threatened him. that threatened what he had to offer. So he wanted to take that away and eliminate that from Susan's life so that she would be forced to rely on him. And throughout the beginning of their relationship, even though he wasn't directly abusing her at that time, he was slowly eliminating her lifelines, and he was isolating her from her friends and family and really gaslighting her, honestly, because especially once they moved out to Utah and were away from Steve and their own problems really started to surface, Josh showed, just like many narcissists show, that he was unwilling to really engage and explore his feelings. If Susan would bring up his, controlling attitude or his despondency in their relationship, he was unwilling to investigate like why that was happening. He was unwilling to explore his emotions and try to get to the bottom of his actions and what was happening with him. He just needed everything to be on his terms, and he didn't want anyone to interfere with that. When Susan began to interfere with that, and when it became clear that she wasn't going to back down, he had no use for her. She was no longer the partner whose only purpose was to serve him and fulfill him. She wasn't doing that anymore. She wasn't living up to the standard that he expected from her. She wasn't being as passive as he demanded of her, so he got rid of her. It's as simple as that. Susan threatened his control and also his status, because as somebody who is narcissistic, I don't think Josh dealt well with rejection, and his wife leaving him and possibly getting custody of the boys would be one of the ultimate rejections in his life, and I don't think he was even willing to take the chance that that might happen, which is why he resorted to killing her rather than seeking out a divorce. Susan even provides evidence of Josh gaslighting her, because they would have really intense fights where both of them are screaming, and Josh would close in on her and use his physical presence to intimidate her and corner her, and with the words he was saying plus the physical position he was forcing her into, sometimes it would cause Susan to react by screaming or yelling or running away, and like I said, one time even slapping him. And this is a great example of gaslighting, because he was provoking her and provoking her and provoking her. When she finally reacted, he recoiled and was like, oh my gosh, that just came out of nowhere. Why would you do that? And made it seem like she was the one in the wrong, that she was the one who just acted out of nowhere and completely instigated whatever had just happened. And Susan, is the victim of a lot of these mind games and this gaslighting. So she has a hard time recognizing the antagonizing behavior that's leading up to this, or even if she does recognize it, she's caught in such a cycle of abuse with Josh that she feels like whatever she did is worse than what he did, and whatever he did to her that she deserves. And I'm sure a lot of people in abusive and dysfunctional relationships struggle with this feeling, and that is such a textbook example of manipulation at its finest, because Susan wasn't the type of person to just lash out and hit Josh, or to react with violence or hatred or malice in any way. But when she was being told that Josh is going to destroy her, and he's closing in on her and backing her into a corner and telling her that she's going to lose her sons, I'm sure that she reacted with emotion, and this tactic of abuse and manipulation is pretty effective because it's completely emotional. And if an abuser has control of you emotionally and mentally, that's the ultimate control, and that's what Josh was after. So everything that he did in their marriage, whether it was love bombing her or agreeing to change and go to counseling, or if it was, arguing and making these veiled, subtle threats. Sometimes the threats weren't even so subtle, but whatever it was all a way to manipulate Susan. He had a certain goal in mind, a certain life and image that he wanted to attain, and Susan just happened to be the one that fit in to make it work at the time. And when she no longer was making it work and she no longer fit into his grand plan in his life, and she threatened his control, he decided to get rid of her. He decided to kill her. Josh is a really great example of an eraser killer because he just thought that he could get rid of Susan, just erase her from his life and erase her from this world, and she would just be forgotten. But the people around her, the people who loved her, her friends, her coworkers, her family, weren't going to just let Josh erase her. And it's classic narcissistic behavior to think that he could just erase somebody. That's entitlement. That's him thinking that if he says something, it should go, that it's whatever he says is worthy of believing, that everybody else should just take it and be like, oh, okay, that's what happened. If Susan just left and went off with another man, then that's what happened. If Josh is innocent and he's a victim, then that's what happened. He's so self-centered that he just thinks that people are going to believe this. It's another example of how he doesn't understand how he's coming across to people. He's a really poor insight into how people perceive him and perceive his actions. Susan had way more people in her court than Josh did. So his head must have been pretty far up his own ass for him to mistakenly believe that he could just get rid of her and carry on raising their kids without any interference from her family, loved ones, or law enforcement. It's classic narcissistic behavior. And that attitude was present in his early life, and it just escalated and escalated literally till the end of his life. So I hope in the future we can gain a better understanding about narcissistic abuse, because it's hard to recognize, especially from the outside. You never know what's happening behind closed doors, and even if you feel like you're privy to the, inner workings of a relationship and the dynamics of a relationship, we really have no idea what goes on when two people are alone together, and Josh and Susan are a classic example of this. This brings me to the topic of how we can recognize abuse and help the people around us who are currently being abused. Abuse is way more prevalent in our society than we'd like to think, and with the rise in popularity of the true crime genre, this is becoming more apparent. The general public is getting filled in that a lot of these horror stories are happening right beyond our front doors. So it's not that far-fetched to think that people around us are facing abuse every day. The problem is it can be very hard to recognize. So talking about it more and analyzing these cases and picking out some of the red flags and talking about the characteristics of the abuse and what it looks like is going to help us become more aware and more familiar with the abuse. And the more familiar we are with it, the better we're going to be able to recognize it if we happen to cross paths with it. Whether it's happening to us or to somebody we love, it's going to take more than one person to recognize it. So I just hope as a society that we can all keep progressing to learn more about this. I'm dedicating this channel to talking about it, raising awareness, and I'm hoping that's going to lead me to some answers and, paths to navigate, like what steps are next and how to move forward with this. I know that I want to do something with forensic psychology in my career, and I'm still progressing through higher education, but this is so important to me, and I feel like it's pertinent in our society. Lives are clearly at stake because of this type of abuse, and this isn't just domestic abuse. There's a lot of unnamed abuse that happens to minorities, people of color, all over the world every single day, and unless we can put a name to it and put characteristics to it, talk about it and get it out in the open, I know it sounds corny, but knowledge is power, and just at least arming ourselves with the education behind it and awareness is going to help us be more equipped to take the next steps into action. And so I guess this is just where I'm starting with that in my own personal journey. I don't want to be passive about this type of stuff. I don't just want to hear about it on the news and cry about it and think about these poor children that lost their lives. I want to make it so that this never happens again. And I hope that I can be a part of the solution in that way, because this is something that I'm not able to shake, and I'm going to take this as far as I can, whether it's through this YouTube channel or through my own personal career. I just want to advocate for children and talk about what this stuff looks like. People who are experiencing narcissistic abuse inflicted on them might not always recognize that what's happening to them is abuse. Like in that armed robber versus the scammer scenario, a really smart, subtle, sneaky abuser will be able to inflict abuse for years and escalate it to the point where a victim wakes up one day and really has no idea how they found themselves in this situation. They might not even see it coming. Susan couldn't document her abuse through pictures of bruises or visits to the ER, but she did document it through her own journals and through the letters that she left in her desk at work and what she told her friends. And this is what we have to go off of. This is what we have to study and look at and try to piece together what happened. And if we can understand what happened and if we can feel like we have just a tiny bit of grasp on it, maybe the next time something like this starts to brew, maybe it can be stopped, but it's going to take more than just one person, because there were a lot of people that were advocating and fighting for Susan and the boys, and unfortunately there were just too many entities against them that were just too preoccupied with systematic protocols to just go in there and stop Josh and stop the Powells. So it's a start for the general public to get on board and get educated about these things, but we have to take it to the next level. We have to take it to these systematic institutions that live in our country and all over the world, because at the end of the day, those are the systems and institutions that have the control over it. They were the ones that made the decision for the boys to go and have this visit with Josh in his home. You know, good people in the public, regular civilians, aren't going to try to interfere with court mandates and stuff like that, so it feels sometimes like our hands are tied, which is why we need to take these issues and take the awareness to the courts, take it to the next step, just like Chuck and Judy, who are fighting to have Charlie and Braden's law. There's a reason that all of this information was uncovered, even if it couldn't save the boys or Susan. They deserved better, but what we're left with right now, we can't just ignore. We can't just let it become forgotten history, like a forgotten newscast, a forgotten story that was trending for a while. We have to take it with us and implement it into everything else that we're doing. It's easy to feel powerless as regular people and civilians when we're faced with powers that are beyond our control, from law enforcement and courts and laws and whatnot, but we can start making a difference by looking out for each other. Keep an eye out for the children that you know and the people in your community, whether they seem at risk or not. Check in with them, see how they're doing, be an asset to them. If somebody is struggling, whether it's with abuse or financially or emotionally or anything, give what you can to help them. Isolation is a scary thing, and it can stop a lot of victims from seeking help. Sometimes just knowing that they have somebody on their side can ease the burden a little bit. We need to lend whatever support we can. It's very easy to get caught up in our own emotions when we see somebody we love or somebody we know who's in an abusive relationship. It can feel very frustrating when you ask them to leave or tell them to leave and offer them resources and they just refuse to take it, or they end up not leaving. But even through that frustration and even through our own emotions and our own heartbreak, we have to continue to be there for them, continue to support them, and be patient, because instances of domestic abuse are not always black and white. There is nuance to that, and we have progressed enough as a society to know that these things come in all shapes and sizes. Things like children or finances and even emotions can stop somebody from leaving an abuser, and all of those are valid reasons. If you're frustrated with somebody who's in an abusive relationship and they're not leaving, expressing that frustration to them can make them feel even more isolated, because not only are they dealing with the stress of being in an abusive relationship, but now they also feel like they're letting down the only lifelines they have. So at all costs, we need to be supportive and non-judgmental and patient for people that we know that are going through abuse. And that doesn't mean just standing by and being passive, but that means relentlessly loving them and supporting them. No matter how many times they fail to leave, I still recommend offering them support, an open door, a place to go, because most likely they're hurting more than you. They're the one that's going through it. When we love somebody or know somebody that's being abused, we're experiencing it indirectly. They're the one that's experiencing it directly. It's way harder for them. If they're not ready to leave immediately, you can help them put together a plan and gather resources so that when they are ready to leave, they know exactly where they're going to go. They're not faced with the question of, where am I going to stay? What am I going to do next? If they start to gather, my dog's running around. If they start to gather these resources and have all of these cushions to fall back on, they might feel more confident in leaving somebody. And I think it takes on average 7 times for a person who's being abused to successfully leave an abusive relationship. A lot of times it's a back and forth thing. So if you know somebody who's experiencing that back and forth, it's normal. It's actually expected. So just try to bear through it with them. A lot of times, especially when the abuse is physical, leaving is the most dangerous. Even though Susan's abuse wasn't physical, when they had their fight of all fights and she had brought up divorce a couple of times, this was obviously the last straw for Josh. He wasn't going to submit to her terms in the marriage, but he also wasn't going to allow her to file for a divorce. He had this mentality of, if I can't have you, no one can. So even though the abuse he was inflicting on her wasn't physical, her making the decision or even bringing up the possibility of leaving was enough to send him into planning the perfect murder mode. If you know somebody who is being abused or you suspect that abuse is taking place in a household, I recommend researching some resources in your area, whether it's women's shelters, domestic abuse hotlines, or other resources for the support group that can help you better handle the situation. Because none of us are born just knowing the exact right and wrong thing to do. None of us are perfect. So we're gonna slip up, we're gonna, get our emotions entangled in things and maybe not make the best judgment calls. But if you think that abuse is taking place around you, you should definitely reach out to local resources because they do exist, and I'll have some posted in the description of this video. There's never any shame to looking into getting help. Like I said, knowledge is power, and when we're equipped with resources and the answers we need in these scary times, they don't seem as scary. Even if you feel like you're alone, you're really not. Narcissistic abuse can be very harmful, especially for someone like Susan. A lot of times we can sort of assess a person's willingness to stay in an abusive relationship when we look at their attitude towards leaving. So Susan was raised in the Mormon church, and in the Mormon church, it's very popular to believe that marriages should last forever. Divorce is a last case scenario, and it should be avoided at all costs. Even if you're going through, really turbulent, rocky times in your marriage, that was something that had been instilled in Susan since she was a child. So even in her journal, she expressed that she believed she had made a vow before God and Josh and that their souls were intertwined for all eternity. And when we consider this mindset that she has, it totally makes sense that she stayed with Josh even if she recognized that he was being financially and emotionally abusive. She thought that staying in the marriage was the best option. It was aligned with her moral beliefs, her religious beliefs. So to me, I guess it's not really a question why she stayed. I totally understand why she stayed. And understanding a victim's reasoning for staying and understanding their mindset and their values around the relationship and staying versus leaving is essential to helping them. Because if we don't understand where they're coming from, we're not going to be able to get through to them. And Susan's parents had tried to sit down with her and talk with her about leaving and talk with her about divorce, and I think maybe if they had more time they would have gotten through to her, because I think that's the exact right approach, you know, to go at it gently, to be patient about it, and to acknowledge their reasons for staying and acknowledge their dedication, but to also point out reasons why it is more harmful than it is good. In the end, everybody makes their own decisions, and we're all responsible for ourselves, and we can sit back and think of all the what ifs, whether it's in the investigation or in the early parts of Susan and Josh's relationship. There's no productivity in judging any of the players involved in this. I mean, obviously we can judge Josh and Steve because they're burning in hell. What we can do with all of the other information is move forward with a better understanding of all of the nuances and dimensions of domestic abuse, and hopefully become agents against it in the future. Susan and the boys deserved better than the end they saw. We can't change that right now. The only way that we can move forward is to make sure that their deaths weren't in vain. Their nightmare's over, but we've inherited it. We can't just forget it. I'm not gonna forget it. This case will always stay with me, and this case has changed me. I don't think I'll move forward in life the same way. And I've already had a couple of life experiences where I've felt like something was off. I've witnessed something that just didn't seem right, and I followed my gut, and I've called CPS before, and it's scary to witness, and it's hard sometimes to make the decision to speak up or to report it. But I just want to say to everybody, as human beings, we need to look out for each other. If you see something that doesn't look right, don't just let it slide. I'm not saying, you know, fully insert yourself and become some vigilante, but offer support, check in on people, ask if they're okay. If you see something that really disturbs you, follow the proper avenues to report it, whether it's to the police or to Child Protective Services. I know there is a lot of stigma attached to, you know, snitching or making those types of reports. Nobody wants to be the person that has to do it, but we need to look out for children and for people who are in vulnerable positions. We need to stop worrying about whether we're gonna rock the boat or make some waves and make people uncomfortable, and we need to take action. I'm so thankful that you stuck it out through all of the parts of this video. It's been a crazy ride. It's been emotional, it's been disturbing. So it's pretty amazing that we've gotten this far. So I'm walking away from this experience feeling like I have a little bit more understanding about the case. I don't feel good about it still, but I feel like I have organized my thoughts a bit more, and I feel like I've come to some conclusions about Josh and, you know, some of the dynamics that led to what happened that I hadn't necessarily considered before. This case has so many dimensions to it. You know, other than the domestic abuse aspect, there is the entire liability of Washington State and the emotional and generational abuse present. It's a case truly unlike any other. So thank you so much for being here. This is the end of the Powell videos. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you thought it was worth sharing, please share it. I think there's a lot of stuff, especially in this video, part 4, that's worth talking about. So share it with a friend, and maybe you guys can have a conversation about it, or drop a comment below and maybe we can keep talking about the interesting aspects of this case. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit the bell for notifications so that you can be the first to know when I come out with my next video. Take care, and please look out for each other and be safe.